coming up, our next session, which is our first sponsored session of the event from William Thomas Digital, is a Women in Deliverability Ask Me Anything session. So we're just bringing up the speakers now. We have 4 very talented marketing professionals here to ask your questions. So do dig around, fill out that Q&A box with all your deliverability questions. They're going to start, I think, with some maybe general conversation about deliverability and then dive right into answering questions from the audience. So if you are out there and have a burning question, that Bimi question probably would have been a great one for this next session as well. So maybe we'll ask it again just to get a different point of view. So coming up, we're going to have LoriBeth Blair. We're going to have Alison Gootee. Hopefully I said your last name right, Alison. And Jennifer Lantz, along with the moderator, Taina Suomela. So Taina is one of our planning committee members here with the Canadian Email Summit, and she's also the founder of Leslieville Digital. So just give us a moment to transition over our speakers, and we'll jump right in and get the next session started.
All right, thanks, Matt. I think we're just waiting for a few of our panelists to join.
I don't see LB yet.
I'm really here. Hello.
Hi, Alison.
Hopefully I didn't butcher your last name too bad. Apologies.
No, it was perfect. Taina and I just had this conversation. I said it rhymes with fruity and booty, and she's like, now I have to remember which one is your name. So
you stole my thunder. I was all prepared for introductions, but it's all good. We can dig right in.
Yeah, problem solved. That's how we work.
Exactly. Efficient.
If you would like to get started, I will try to figure out where LB is and get her to join us on the call. So please, I will drop off and start finding your other panel member.
Sounds good. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm super excited to be moderating this panel today. I've been in the digital agency space for about 15 years, about 5 years in email. And one of the things that I love about the email space is some of the amazing, smart people that I get to work with and talk to. And our panel today is no different. So we've got 2 of our panelists and hopefully a third joining us shortly, but so Alison Gootee, who is the Compliance and Deliverability Enablement Principal at Braze, and Jen Lantz, who is the VP of Industry Relations and Deliverability at Kickbox. And we did, as Matt mentioned a little bit earlier in the day, we did do a little bit, and now we have LB Blair joining us as well momentarily, who is the founder of Platonic Ideal, and also a rock star in the deliverability space. So welcome, everybody. So as Matt said earlier, we did a little bit of polling in advance of this session to get a sense for what people wanted us to talk about and answer. And again, we've only got about 25 minutes. So truly, we could spend all day talking about deliverability. So we wanted to focus a little bit on what everybody was looking for. So, and there really kind of ended up being 2 topics that across a couple of polls that we ran that jumped up to the top. So I thought we would start with a conversation around what you guys think should be the responsibilities of the individual, the marketer versus the ESP. So there definitely seems to be a little bit of tension that sometimes happens, especially if there's a deliverability issue and confusion as to who should be doing what to make sure that there is a strong program that emails end up in the inbox. And certainly it's a shared responsibility across that whole spectrum, both from the marketer, the advertiser, to any agency that's working in between, and then certainly on the ESP side as well, their responsibilities. So whichever one wants to kick it off, want to sort of lend us your thoughts, and we can talk about that a little bit first.
I want to go first because I'm biased. So yeah, Jen, please go.
I love what you started there with. I think a lot of it is there's a shared responsibility. I think that's really important because it's throughout this whole process when you're working with your ESP, you each have kind of core things to work on, but ultimately you need to work together. And so for the sender, I think the biggest responsibility they have is around data and ensuring there's consent there, consent, and making sure that they have the feeds with their provider. This is where you work together to make sure that, I don't know if they're going to be the processor or how they're handling the data, but whatever information they're getting that needs to update your list, that you work together to make sure that those feeds are there, that your list is always as clean as possible, that you're processing bounces and all of that good stuff. I think your provider needs to, they have to function with the infrastructure and all of the details of the platform, making sure it's up and running, making sure that it's secure and protected. I think I could go on for more, but I'm going to pause right there for a second because I want Alison to have a chance too. But those would be my top two things.
Yeah, totally. I started out by saying I'm biased a bit because I have always worked on the ESP side. And so obviously I have dealt a lot with customers coming to me and saying, hey, you guys should fix this problem. And I have to, gently break it to them that this part of the problem is actually going to be your responsibility to fix. And I'm happy to give you the information needed to make those decisions and make those changes. But a lot of this is really going to be driven by the sender's behavior. For example, in my current role at Braze, all of our customers are on dedicated IPs. And so keeping their IP healthy really falls pretty much under the customer's umbrella, as long as, we're doing our job and making everything technically able to send email. Whereas previously I've worked in shared IP environments where we did have a little bit more obligation on the ESP side to make sure that those IPs were healthy, which is where, your compliance team will come in. So if you're in a shared IP environment and you ever hear from the compliance team reaching out from you and notifying you of an issue, it's a good thing. It's not the best, but they're letting you know how to fix it. And you should definitely take their advice to heart, because not only will it help others in maintaining that shared IP health, but it helps you. It helps your email get to the inbox too. And so if you don't have all those best practices in place, and maybe if the other people on your same ESP don't have the best practices in place, then you're going to be in a little bit of trouble there. So definitely keep in mind, what your environment is and how that's going to affect what you need to do in the end. LB, what about you?
Yeah, so I've worked for 2 ESPs as well, but recently I've been working a little more on the brand side. So I'm going to take that perspective. I think the core responsibilities of the ESP are obviously delivery. I think there's a lot that's packed into that, like as far as all the way down to how the MTA is configured, and is it optimally throttled for like each mail provider that you're sending to, and is it optimally throttled for each customer account even, like, because I think there's even farther you can go. I mean, frankly, I think most ESPs should like have that as an advanced feature that customers can unlock. And even play with some of their own throttlings, because I've recently run into some issues where, one of my clients is getting more throttled at a provider like Spectrum than probably the general pool of clients are. And even though we're on dedicated IPs, we can't control our own throttle, which is a little frustrating. The other thing I would say is reporting is a huge responsibility on the ESP, providing access to data. So that senders can make smart decisions. Like one thing that I see across the countless ESPs that I work in is there's a big divide between those that essentially provide bounce messages in the platform and those that do not provide bounce messages in the platform. Because otherwise, without the bounce messages, I'm not really sure how how clients are going to figure out issues like, hey, we've got a huge invalid recipient, bounce rate, which indicates that we've basically got some kind of, we've got some kind of data hygiene problem, or, seeing those bounce messages to see, okay, yeah, we're throttled at, we're being throttled at Spectrum. We need to, ease back on the throttle or reduce how much email we're sending to that provider. So I would say, the big responsibility on most ESPs that one of the things one of the hills I will die on is access to data. Give the senders all the data so that they can make decisions. I also like some talk like about some timely news today. MailChimp sold recently for $12 billion, if you didn't hear. And I think one of the things that MailChimp does really well is they make it really hard for you to shoot yourself in the foot. Because I had a client that had, some, they were using giveaways that were kind of unrelated to their brand to acquire new contacts. And this resulted in their welcome series having a huge unsubscribe rate. Well, the welcome series email was such a small drip in the bucket compared to the campaign blast that they were sending. We might have never noticed that problem if MailChimp didn't throw us a warning and actually like shut that series down and say, hey, you got a huge unsubscribe rate on the first email in the series. You need to do something about that. I think that's an area where they did a really excellent job of putting some like rails up on the platform to protect senders from themselves.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that you made me think of is maybe when shopping for ESPs, or even when you're just like taking another look at your own email program, think about which things are the ESP's responsibility that maybe you're not used to or that become your responsibility. Because, for example, MailChimp will manage your soft bounces. And after, I forget what their current number is, but 3 or 5 or 7 consecutive soft bounces, they'll basically stop sending to that email address and consider it, to have bounced off of the list. However, where I work now, we do not manage soft bounces and it's up to the customer. And so I think that kind of a change is something that a lot of senders maybe haven't thought about or even considered as an option. And so when I let senders that I'm working with know, hey, you need to implement a sunset policy. Some of these people are soft bouncing, a ton of times consecutively over a long period of time. And they're like, oh my God, I had no idea that I was supposed to even do that. And so I think, they have a large portion of their list that has become unhealthy and maybe even could point to a list collection issue or some other deeper problem. And they've just been totally unaware because, again, they're not digging into the data like we might, or maybe they don't have access. And so I totally agree with LB's point that, having access to that data is really everyone's probably responsibility and a great way to make sure that you're doing everything that you need to be doing. Yeah.
I agree. I think part of that too is transparency. We often don't even know what to ask for. So I think if you can go to your provider and say, I don't know what I have access to, can you help me? Or like, what data do you have? Like LB was saying, what are your bounce rules? What are your MTA configurations? And you may not know every question to ask, but just sometimes you just say, start from scratch and tell me exactly on a high level how you work. What are the rules and logic that you have? Is it overall, or can it be customized? And then what information, are there automated reports or alerts that you can send? And if not, what can I do? And then what services in terms of strategy come with your contract, and what do you have to pay extra for? Because some of them, there might be extra insight that they can give you, but you might need to pay extra for. And some of it is you just have to ask. So I think going back and saying, what can I do to improve, and seeing what they come back with might help you also figure out, is that their responsibility or mine to help, improving your program, I think is ultimately a sender's, but you need guidance from them because you need to know, well, where is my problem? Is it deliverability, or is it, I have a really bad piece of content here? So I think getting guidance from them is their responsibility, but ultimately you're in control of your program and the success.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That's great context, and you really went where my mind was going in helping marketers, figure out what questions they should be asking. And I think with deliverability in particular, it's a part of the business that is a little bit of a mystery to many, and they don't, they understand it's important, but don't necessarily understand all the complexity and the components of it. So I think there's some great insight in there on questions, whether you're shopping for an ESP or going to your existing one, and asking some questions, asking about throttling, asking about the MTA, asking about some of these things that happen in the background that can really impact your program. So that was some great insight there. Is there anything else in that you guys want to add to the discussion around, what they should be thinking about, or questions that somebody may not innately, if you're not a deliverability professional, and you wouldn't necessarily innately ask the question? But is there anything else that they should ask their ESP, and so they know what options are available to them?
I was going to say, I think a couple of things that I've run into recently are around editors. I've seen issues where some drag and drop editors, like not all drag and drop editors are created equal. Some of them produce very bulky amounts of code that cause you clipping emails at clipping issues at Gmail. So I think that's incumbent upon the ESP to provide a very functional drag and drop editor, but also just a simple custom HTML editor where I can upload an HTML file and the ESP isn't going to like change anything in the code that I uploaded. Because I think, you know, for larger brands, like some of the larger e-commerces that I manage, it's really important for us to be able to like just upload our code direct from our experts and not have the ESP make any changes to it before they send it out.
I think that's great. I think also I would ask about authentication too. That's huge for deliverability. And sometimes, at least with smaller senders, you often are given kind of a small set of just put this in there so you can mail. But try to educate yourself on what authentication means. So, you know, are you authenticating with your domain and your brand, or are you using your senders, your providers, and try to figure out what's currently in place now. If you don't know, I would always recommend using your own brand, because it's great for DKIM, it's great for DMARC and all the other protocols that, you know, Matthew started with mentioning Bimi. But, you know, part of that is you need to be with your own, authenticating with your own brand. So I'd ask about that for your ESP as well. I think it's really important, and I don't think enough people know about authentication and what's being deployed for them.
Excellent. So brought up authentication. One of the questions that has come from one of our anonymous attendees is your thoughts on Bimi. So I don't know. Do you want to, when we start with Alison, and maybe we can go around and or if you don't have any thoughts.
I have no Bimi thoughts. I'm here to learn on that.
Or any volunteers thoughts on Bimi? Lori, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bimi is great. I think it's something that marketers have been asking for years, since I was like back at IBM, is a way to control their contact icon at Yahoo and now Gmail. So I think, and the fact, you know, Gmail is like 40 to 60% of most people's lists now that it works at Gmail. I think the time to get on, it's absolutely time to get on board with Bimi. Now, I think there are some challenges, because you have to trademark whatever icon you're going to use, and you have to get a verified mark certificate for it. But those aren't too pricey. And I think, you know, if you're a sender, you know, at least in the millions per month, I think it's like a no-brainer to go ahead and go with Bimi. And get somebody to set it up for you.
So speaking of senders and Gmails, the other big question that came out of our poll that we sent out in advance was understanding the quirks of the big four ESPs, and obviously that could be a several-hour conversation. But you know, why don't each of you, again, we can start with Alison, talk about what you've learned and the things that you want, you think people should know, and the observations that you've had working with the different senders that could help somebody avoid issues or be proactive, or just understand what's happening in their metrics if they're seeing wonky stuff going on, a little bit of a sense of why that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have many opinions on this, so buckle down. We're going to be in for a bumpy ride here.
On.
Yeah. So, you know, it's funny because you'll hear a lot of senders ask questions about Gmail. Obviously, as LB said, Gmail is, you know, the large portion of most people's lists. But I find that maybe because they have so much traffic and their algorithms are so advanced and always learning, that I find a lot of my senders don't have that big of an issue with Gmail. And I think Gmail is fairly good at kind of sussing out the sender's true heart, where it's like, are they trying hard, and do they want to actually reach people who want to hear from them? And can I forgive some of this other stuff and send it to the spam folder? Because I've had senders who I have worked with repeatedly on doing a better job at list collection, where maybe they have like an issue with their sign up form being abused by bots, or they're just, you know, saying, hey, we'll send emails to everyone who registers or downloads our app. But as long as they're a brand that has high engagement, sends good content for the most part that is fairly engaging or at least useful, coupons or updates, not things that people are not interested in, I feel like they do pretty well. They may see some spam folder placement, but it's incredibly rare to see anyone blocked for a reputation reason at Gmail. And I work with senders who send millions of emails on a daily basis. And I just, digging in their logs, it's very rare to see any kind of Gmail activity that indicates anything beyond like a closed mailbox or something like that. Whereas I think Microsoft tends to think one rotten apple spoils the bunch. And this is just in my experience. This is not an official thing that they have released, but to the contrary, I have senders who, again, do very well at Gmail, and we struggle at Microsoft. We end up with blocks, we're on their block list, or they're getting throttled for volume due to elevated complaints, which don't seem to show up anywhere. So for both of those two big ones, I definitely recommend enrolling in Google Postmaster Tools and SNDS if you haven't already. You may be thinking that sounds hard or I don't want to, but it can be really revealing, and it can even help you build a case with Microsoft when they're saying that you're having trouble. The very first thing they always say is enroll in SNDS and JMRP, and you can come back to them and say, I did do that. Everything looks really good. And they'll say something else like perhaps, hey, we've been seeing a pattern of irregular volume, and I can send them my logs and say, my volume does not look irregular. Can you clarify? And then they say, just kidding, you're good to go. And so I still don't know specifically what has pushed us over the threshold at Microsoft, but they seem to take a very hardline stance on maybe minimal behaviors that Gmail may not take a hard stance on. So those are my big two. I'll stop there.
I love all the insight into the remediation process. I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. You check my LinkedIn for my memes about how I feel about that.
That's awesome. So Elby, what about you?
Yeah, so I think there are definitely some quirks and differences. I would say that I see a lot of the same behavior that Alison's talked about. As far as Gmail, really, if you're doing email right, you're going to get to the Gmail inbox. You're going to have a high reputation in Google Postmaster Tools. I think some interesting quirks about Gmail is that one, yeah, if you're, as we mentioned earlier, if your code is too hefty, then Gmail is going to truncate it at 102 kilobytes. And I believe this question was asked in the Q&A, and I'm just going to answer it. The only way to fix the truncating issue at Gmail is to reduce your code file size. So you have to get it down below 102 kilobytes to avoid getting truncated. And that's not counting your images. So it counts the image URLs as part of the code, but it doesn't count the image itself as part of the code weight. So you have to make sure your code is nice and clean. And there are various services out there that can help you with like cleaning up your code and flagging best practices, and things like that. The other big quirk I would say about Gmail is they're very privacy first, which means that they're not going to route you any complaints back. They don't have a traditional feedback loop like maybe AOL or Yahoo does, where they send you, whenever somebody complains, you get a report on it and you can suppress that email address. Doesn't happen like that at Gmail. So what you have to do is you have to keep laser focused on your Google Postmaster Tools. And this is a throwback to the what should your ESP do? They should utilize Google's feedback header ID to populate it with different variables to help senders, especially very large scale senders, narrow down exactly which campaigns are causing elevated rates of complaint at Gmail. And so, yeah, I would say that's a big quirk. The other thing is, I would say I found that Microsoft and Yahoo and AOL are both relatively more sensitive to increases in volume. Because I've had some of my e-commerce senders, like they would send elevated amounts of volume around big sale weekends and things like that. And invariably we get like our open rates at like Microsoft will just tank. Yahoo's kind of either or, it depends, but Microsoft pretty much every time we spike up our volume, the next day our open rate is terrible. And then we have to rebuild that reputation. So I would say, I'd say that's a big quirk. But yeah, another thing I've noticed with Gmail recently is that they seem to care a fair amount about your history in the channel. Like I've just found that brands with more history in the channel, the longer that you've been in the email channel and sending like high volumes of email, the more you can kind of get away with versus, as far as fluctuating your volume or like increasing volume kind of precipitously, whereas you can get away with none of that at Microsoft. Yeah, so that's basically what I got.
Awesome. I agree with a lot of those things. With Elboy's comment about the content size, one thing, and this also goes back to the ESP responsibilities. I had a client once that they kept getting clipped, but it was because of the redirects. The redirects were so large, they were adding a lot of code weight. And so if you're coming up to that issue, don't use URL shorteners because they also, some of them have really bad reputation and that can also tank your deliverability. Instead, work with your ESP on what can we do so that my redirects aren't causing a lot of excess weight, so we don't see trimming. And I think, I echo everything in terms of Gmail. If you're a good sender, you typically don't have a lot of issues. But I know one client had a problem with, they were using what we call a cousin domain. So it wasn't their typical domain that you go to the site, but it was something that was like it. So instead of, zoom.us, it was web-zoom.us, just something very similar. And because of that, they weren't able to really associate the reputation and where the site was actually going. And so I think that caused a lot of problems, and we had to do a lot of remediation on this is the site and it actually goes here and it's really their domain and they're not trying to spoof. So those things are all, Gmail gets so much, every provider gets so much spam and spoofing that they really try to be cognizant of it. And so you need to really identify yourself and prove what you're doing. With Microsoft, I noticed that and I think a lot of people do, especially for any of the industry threads, new IPs, new senders at Microsoft are going to struggle. And it's something everyone deals with. So you're not alone. You will be throttled. You will go to the bulk folder and you will do it for at least 2 weeks, if not months. It's definitely a struggle. They don't like new senders. I noticed that people who have been sending an IP for years, they just like LB mentioned with Gmail, they tend to get have a little bit more leeway with Microsoft, but without any reputation, you're going to struggle at Microsoft. And I would like to say there's one way to fix it. You keep pushing best practices, target your engaged, go slow, don't push it. But even with that, it's going to take a long time.
Oh, I think that's a good point. Sorry, if I may. I have a lot of senders who are concerned about, I feel like there is this thing where senders want to like maintain some level of secrecy about what they're doing, right? It's why like they're reluctant to ask for real permission. They're reluctant to ask subscribers what sorts of things they want to receive or how often. And so sometimes the sender will say, well, can I tell people that we're switching? And I'm like, yeah, tell them, load them up with information, let them know you're going to be changing. Email is going to be coming from somewhere else. If you have other channels, if you have a website, if you have an Instagram that people are looking at, tell them, say, hey, we switched ESPs. The mail may be going to your spam folder, because we've seen evidence or have suspected that Microsoft, for example, is waiting for those signals, like specifically people moving mail from the junk folder to the inbox. It's such a strong, powerful, positive signal. It's like the antithesis of a spam complaint, right? It's people saying, no, I love this stuff. So definitely let your subscribers know, hey, check in your spam folder. It doesn't make you a spammer by association. It's just the way it works because you're new. You've just made a change like that. So yeah, for sure, generating those very strong positive signals, I think helps. And there's just been this reluctance where it's like, I don't want to let my customers know I'm having trouble. Let them know they're your customers. They like, ideally they're interested in the stuff that you're sending to them. And if you're afraid that they're not, and they're fine with it going to the spam folder, then that's an evidence of a deeper issue. Sorry, Taina, back to you.
No. It's great context. I think I just wanted to go into one of the questions that came through the Q&A, and I think this is in reference to what you were talking about earlier. What do you include with the volume logs that you send to Microsoft, and they're saying they see this issue all the time? So I think to your last comment, some of the things that might help them figure out what to send and to get through that process.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I just send them screenshots. Like, I mean, I have, a nice chart of my logs, like say from SendGrid or whatever visualization tool you might be using. Whatever you're using in your ESP, it should have some kind of record of what volume you've been sending. And I have a nice little chart that shows week by week, no fluctuation the bar graphs are like exactly equal. And so I said, to be fair, this is a sender with, 3 or 4 IPs, I can't remember. And so maybe we're not like, isolating the volume on each one regularly enough. Could you give me any more insight? And they were just like, oh, you're remediated. So it's like, I don't think they want to give too much advice, obviously, because then I could just tell all my friends that I'm talking to today about what exactly to do. But I think if, to Microsoft's credit, if you can provide evidence showing that you really are trying to do the right thing, they are slightly more lenient. I wish they had more of Gmail's attitude where you were innocent until proven guilty instead of the reverse, but at least there are some options for remediation. But first, I just screenshots. I give them as much information as I can, maybe to the point of overwhelming them, but it seems to work.
Yes, write them a novel. That's what I found at Microsoft. Like, absolutely write them, like, tell them what you've already tried. Tell them, hey, we've tried to stop sending for 2 days to see if it's a smart screen issue. Like, we've tried, and provide them with data. Like, okay, this is our volume for the last several weeks. I think the format of the data matters a lot less than provide them the data. And say, hey, on our end, we're not seeing a bunch of spam complaints. Let them know we're enrolled in JMRP, we're enrolled in SNDS, we're monitoring it. Here's what I'm seeing. So yeah, I think that's what's really important, is just to provide them make a strong case for it, like why you should be remediated.
Yeah, and I like that advice to be specific too, because even in the deliverability space, sometimes people will say, "Oh, we've tried everything," and I'm like, "Well, what do you think everything is?" Because I don't know what you've tried. I'm not seeing any changes in your results. So, can you please name those things? And I think Microsoft would probably enjoy that same context, like, what is everything to you? And, naming the things that they put in their own documentation about what they want to see from senders. Ideally, they should already have seen those things, but they're a big place.
You could even mention the targeting that you're using. You could ask your ESP, what are our connections that we're doing? Because if they're seeing more than what you are supposed to be sending, sometimes then there might be a change that needs to be made. Provide headers. If you have an example of something that went to the bulk, there's codes in those headers that they can then look up and try and figure out. They won't tell you what they are, but it might help direct them on what the issue is. And something with Microsoft too is we think about spam complaints. We don't get every spam complaint from a lot of the FBLs that we get. So there could be a bigger problem than what you realize. But Microsoft also has SRD, which is their way to poll their customers to say, do you consider this spam or junk? And I think that weighs in heavily as well. So you won't see that either, but it is something that weighs in. So sometimes there are issues that may not be apparent. So really trying to dig in with your customers too on what is the expectations you're setting, because you might have consent, but maybe they don't realize they're going to be hit 5 times. So I think looking at kind of the flow and any feedback you have from your customers will be helpful too.
And that's actually a great segue into one of the follow-up questions that came up in the Q&A, was they were wondering if for programs that have variable fluctuations in their sending patterns, depending on how they target or send, and certainly personalized campaigns, are key. So how can you expect the same volume every day? So if you end up in that situation where you do in fact have, ups and downs in your sending patterns just based on being personalized and targeted, what does that mean for Microsoft? Is there a way for that to be okay? Or does that suddenly send off a bunch of red flags?
So I am sure this depends on your ESP. For us, we have, throttling controls that our users can use. So if we're seeing that they're having volume, issues at Microsoft being accepted, we might tell them, hey, drop down to 500 emails, per hour or per minute, whatever we set the throttling to. I don't remember what the controls are because I don't work on that side of sending email. But there should be options at your ESP where you can rate limit your sends. If you don't have that option, I definitely do think that will be more difficult. Like I said, Microsoft isn't going to tell us what their throttling limits are. We generally say that if you have a healthy reputation, you can expect to double your volume day over day. But, I don't work at Microsoft and they are very opaque. So I am definitely curious, Jen, LB, what have your experiences been with that?
I think for me, depending on what your volume fluctuations are, because there could be a large gap or a small one, and it depends on how big that gap is. will determine what you can and cannot do. And I think too, like once you establish your sending patterns and you've established it over time, you can have some fluctuations, but you can ramp up. So even if the MTA doesn't have a specific setting that can be configured, if you don't have a time sensitive campaign, you can push it over a couple instances to help kind of not hit it all at once and just push it across the day. I think that can help. And sometimes you can even file a ticket ahead of time if you know you're going to have certain fluctuations. So if you're going to ramp up, you could say, hey, I've got a larger volume coming in. This is going to be kind of the new norm, or this is my new pattern or something like that. It may or may not help, but it's one way to preemptively work towards that.
I think it's a great insight. I don't know if people realize they can do that. So as opposed to, acting, after the fact and trying to get things fixed, being proactive and saying, hey, it's legitimate. This is what we're going to be doing. And hopefully that helps you in the positive side. One of the other questions that just came up, we have about 5 minutes left or 4 minutes left, was when do you reach out to the ISP versus the ESP? So what do you recommend for a marketer that, is having an issue or is having a problem? Should they go to the ESP first and then through that try to reach out to the ISP, or does it make sense to build a relationship directly with the ISP?
I personally would always start with the ESP because the ESP may already have relationships that you can lean on, or I also think that for instance, there are some bounds reasons that say like contact your provider, they're on our block list. And in our case, it's not us. Our customers are dedicated IP. So they'll come to us and say, hey, you're on the block list. And I'm like, no, you are. But I can at least give them help in figuring out what to do, because I think if they were to reach out to Hotmail specifically themselves, they would probably be still frustrated, but more frustrated maybe than talking to me, because again, it's such a rigmarole to like get them to actually give you any information. So at least if I could prepare them and say, hey, you're going to have to write back to them 5 or 10 times, they may not get that transparency from Microsoft directly. So I would always start with ESP, just because we've definitely been in this rodeo several times and can kind of, be that shoulder to lean on. I mean, you can reach out to the direct ISP if you want, but I would start with the ESP.
Yeah, I would definitely say get some coaching from your ESP. Like figure out what, you really want to troubleshoot things as far as you can on your own, and then present that case to whatever ISP you need to approach. And there's always the chance that your ESP will say yes, that they'll take care of this issue for you. There's always a chance. It never hurt. The worst thing they'll say is no, this is on you.
Yep.
And generally, even if they do send you packing, they're going to send you with some nuggets of wisdom that are going to help you, like things to say to the ISP, things not to say to the ISP, all of that type of stuff to just help coach you to get the optimal outcome for yourself.
I agree. I would go to the ESP first, because remember, they have a lot of clients. So what's happening to you may also be happening to someone else. So they might say, look, this is a problem happening everywhere, Microsoft. So, this is what we're all dealing with. Feel free to reach out on your own. And like Albie and Alison said, these are some things to look at. And sometimes with some providers, they need to actually hear from the owners of the IPs to maybe confirm ownership and stuff. So you really do need your ESP, because they have access to confirm ownership and stuff. So I would definitely start with them and then go from there.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. I will add one more tip to that list, and it is to be nice and friendly to your deliverability professionals in your life. Make friends and keep them close, because they are absolutely a fountain of information. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was really fun. I know I learned a ton. If any other questions come through, let us know. We can look at getting you answers as well. But thank you, everyone, and I'll kick it back to Matt.